very, very important to choose words correctly. And one of the most almost sensitive topics right now that can never be discussed is Israel, the war between Israel and Palestine.
That's right.
What's your stance on that?
Well, first of all, going back to what you said about the importance of words, that's something I've been very conscious all my life and more attuned to it and more aware of it as I've got older, because the precise words that you use make such a difference, because of course we communicate with words and we react to words with very emotional reactions sometimes. Now, you asked me about Israel and Palestine. I've been following the Israel-Palestine conflict since I was about 12 years old, because even as a child, I was a news junkie. And in my early teenage years, I used to get my father to buy a copy of the Sunday Times newspaper and a copy of the Observer newspaper for me every Sunday, and almost the whole of Sunday would be spent with me lying in bed with the newspaper on the floor, because newspapers are very bulky, reading the newspaper more or less from cover to cover.
12 years old.
Yes.
It's crazy.
So, and the reason I remember this is that at those times, there were regularly terrorist attacks into Israel by Palestinian guerrillas from Lebanon or from Syria or from Jordan. And they used to call themselves Fedayeen, which means something like freedom fighters or guerrilla fighters. It's a phrase you never hear anymore now. So I've been following the conflict ever since. I was 16 years old at the time of the Six-Day War. And so I remember very clearly myself the build-up to the war and then the war itself happening, how shocking it was. I remember the Yom Kippur War. So I've lived through the conflict. And I'll be quite honest, as a young teenager, you, especially if you are from a Muslim background, you, without knowing very much, or without knowing anything about the situation other than what I read in the newspapers, which is just the latest sort of incident, I grew up with a natural sympathy for my fellow Muslims, the Palestinian Arabs. Although, of course, many of the Palestinians are not Arabs, they're also Christians in a significant minority. The older I've got over the last 60 years, and the more I've learned about it, the more my sympathies are much more balanced. You're never exactly 50-50 about anything, but I'm much more sympathetic to the Jewish perspective on the conflict now than I was when I was 12 years old, for example, much more sympathetic. And I have written about the Israel-Palestinian conflict on my website. I've given 3 presentations on the conflict. The first one was given to a school in London, the Francis Holland School, which is a girls' school. I gave a talk to their 6th form politics society for about 20 minutes. And the point I emphasized in that talk, because you're talking to school children, you're not trying to indoctrinate them, you're not trying to get them to support one side or the other. I emphasized that people behave with the conflict the way that they behave with football. They pick a side, whether they pick the Palestinian side or the Israeli side, then afterwards, everything that their side does is correct, and everything that the other side does is wrong, and that's all they want. That's the only way they think about it. And I emphasized to these 6th form girls that they had a responsibility to learn about the history, to understand that there are wrongs on both sides and rights on both sides.
And it's very important to explore those different points of view. And but tell me more about how do you come to conclusions in regards to this war? Because many people are debating whether the proportion of the Israel's response to the attack on October 7th. And on the other side, of course, many people are debating how Israel has been behaving towards Palestine over the years. And of course, balancing out with the fact that in Palestine there is no clear there is in a way like a power vacuum, and everybody who, all the, let's say, all the organizations who are basically supporting and helping Palestinians to live are now described as terrorist organizations. So it is a very hard situation there. But what do you make of it?
Well, as you say, it's a very hard situation. It's a very complicated situation. And the thing to remember is that people's behaviors and actions are always heavily influenced, not totally determined, but very heavily influenced by the way that the other party has behaved towards them. Mm-hmm. And we don't have time to start from 1917 or 1900 onwards, but if we just start from the 7th of October, 2023, as a starting point, because it keeps the discussion shorter, Hamas's assault on Israel and the massacre of Israeli civilians was absolutely monstrous. As Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said, it didn't come out of a clear blue sky. History didn't start on that day, but let's just start from there. So that was a monstrous attack. Israel had the choice of how to respond. At the level of human nature, and also when you look at Benjamin Netanyahu's internal legal problems in Israel, his political problems vis-a-vis his coalition, I can understand, and the word understand in English is often misunderstood because it means two different things. I understand you can mean I sympathize. I understand can mean I comprehend. And those are two totally different meanings of the word. I'm using it in the sense of comprehend. I can comprehend why Israel has responded the way that it did. But what Israel has ended up doing is fighting what I would describe as a war of revenge. Israel is trying to destroy Hamas, but frankly, if you look at its behavior, it almost doesn't care how many innocent Palestinians get killed along the way. And that, of course, has in turn resulted in a worldwide reaction of increased hostility to Israel. Was it the best strategy for Israel to follow? In my view, no. And if you want that, we can spend more time talking about what was the correct strategy. But I'm a critic of Hamas. I'm a critic of Benjamin Netanyahu and the behavior of the Israeli government. You can criticize both.
Well, let me switch a little bit from this particular war to how the world has responded to this war, as many countries, powerful countries like the US, like the UK, are publicly supporting Israel because it's a trading partner, because it benefits them to support Israel. Many of the simpler people who are not in the government have stood up in support of Palestine. And those hostilities that have been created on both sides towards Jewish people who are not necessarily involved with the war, just living in other countries, and towards Muslim people who are once again not involved but living in the UK, for example, they are very much seen in the society right now. How would you explain to a normal person that the war and the actions of Israeli government has nothing to do with, does not necessarily have to result in hatred towards a certain nation or nationality?
Again, it's really important to remember that individuals who live outside Israel, whether they're Jewish or whether they are Muslim, they are not, or whether even if they are Palestinian origin, they are not responsible for the conduct of either Hamas or the conduct of the Israeli government. And furthermore, a Jewish person, for example, living in this country is perfectly entitled to be supportive of the existence of the State of Israel. I'm supportive of the existence of the State of Israel. I do not want to see Israel destroyed. I think that would be catastrophic. I know a great deal about the history of the Holocaust. I've been to Auschwitz. I think it's actually highly desirable to have a state which has a Jewish majority population, but provided it's a state that provides full civil rights for all of its citizens. So the key thing is people need to remember that when they talk about the conflict, they should talk about the conflict in measured language, not using language that demonizes the party that they disagree with. And they need to remember that their fellow citizens are not the people that they are talking about. They're talking about a foreign country and the behavior of foreign